In today's Truth, I'll be talking about my experiences as a first generation Australian and how I feel about Australia Day, whether I care about it and why. So, in this episode of One Day I'll Tell the Truth, I'm talking about the truth about Australia Day for a first generation Aussie. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? So, as the title states, I'm a first generation Australian. And what I wanted to talk about today is what it feels like to be a first generation Australian and what does it mean for those of you listening? Does me telling my story help you? And, you know, and this is more so for my Australian audience, but does it help you to look back at your own life and say, you know what, maybe he's onto something here? I don't know. But let's find out, shall we? So for all my overseas listeners, this is a very Australian episode as the focus is on our National Day here in Australia, which is celebrated on the 26th of January. And there's a debate that has been around for many, many years, probably since Australia Day was first celebrated. And it basically revolves around changing the date. And this is primarily because of the way that the Indigenous Australians feel about it. And I'm going to reflect on how I feel about it and why. And perhaps by doing that, I'll help people have a deeper understanding on the subject. So the date itself is a major point of contention. In many people's eyes, it represents the date of the disposition of the Aboriginal people. The day that they lost their nation. And in many circles, not just Indigenous, it's referred to as Invasion Day. Now, Australia Day makes us think about what it means to be Australian. So if we do that, even for a moment, just that, because it's Australia Day and, you know, you're celebrating or not, and we look at the reasons why that's the case, if we look at our own situations, whether we're grateful for the current conditions that we find ourselves in or not, and honestly compare them to the plight of, you know, the Indigenous people. If you take a close look at the history, and when I do, I can't help but have mixed feelings about the day. I have a pretty vivid memory of my childhood, and I remember the Australia that I grew up in, and back in the 70s when I first began to remember Australia Day as a public holiday, it usually meant that it was time to go back to school soon. And I didn't want to go back to school, and there are a number of personal reasons for that, which I'll go into in future episodes. But it does go to the heart of what it means for me. So a bit more on my childhood. I grew up on a very diverse street in the southern suburbs of Wollongong, about an hour's drive south of Sydney. It's a small suburb called Kamblawarra, and back then it was part industrial wasteland, part lower socioeconomic housing, part Aboriginal mission. It was built on what had previously been majestic wetlands filled in with thousands of tons of industrial waste from the nearby steelworks. 3 streets running parallel to one another, every nationality represented, a pure blend of 70s working class Australia mixed with the original custodians of the land, whose housing estate bordered a rubbish dump less than 200 metres up the road from the block of flats that I lived in with my sister and parents. And when I say every nationality represented, I mean it. Like, I don't know if you could find a more multicultural street in all of Australia as far as diversity goes at that time, and not so much in terms of volume. There were the 10-pound poms, the British migrants. There were Spanish. There were a number of Spanish families, Portuguese, Italian, Greek, Macedonian, Serbian, Croatian. Although those 3 back then were still classed as Yugoslav, German, a Dutch family, an Argentinian family, and of course the Aboriginal community. They had their own section at the top of the street, which back then was called the Kumedici Mission, or just the Mission, or just Kumedici. And as a child, I found myself playing with all these kids from all these different backgrounds, and it was just nuts. It was just wild running around the streets. There were loads of kids that were my age, and just children from all different backgrounds. And growing up in this place where there were so many people from so many different places. Well, look, I didn't make the differentiation. I just thought, well, this is just how it is, and I know it was like that for many of you listening in. But as soon as school started, that kind of all changed. There was still the diversity, but yeah, it was different. There were definitely no Aboriginal kids at the Catholic primary school that I went to. There were a couple that came later on, but I struggled a lot with English early on. Spanish had been my first language, so when I went to primary school, I struggled early on. Yeah, obviously I did pick up the English language eventually. I think that highlights just how my family and others in the area were able to, well, hold on to their language. So yeah, I had family in the street, so I was regularly speaking Spanish. So that probably was a big reason why it was harder to pick up English. So yeah, my dad had come to Australia in the 60s with a couple of his brothers. They made their families and made their home here. Then there was an extended network of Spanish families in neighbouring suburbs, and we also developed close ties with other nationalities, primarily from where we were living. Italian family, a couple of Italian families became close friends, an Argentinian family. We even went to a couple of Macedonian weddings, I remember, as a young child. And I guess another thing that stands out was how we were able to maintain our culture as far as food goes as well. And eventually my dad and his brothers got together with other Spanish families from the neighbouring suburbs, and they put together some money and actually bought a vacant block of land, just probably was just about 100 metres up the road from where we were living at the time. And they built a club, which eventually became known as the Wollongong Spanish Club, unlike many other ethnic groups which had done the same thing during the 70s and 80s. In the same suburb, there was a Portuguese club. A few suburbs away, there was the Greek Hellenic club, a couple of Italian clubs, a German club, and I guess this was along with the workers' clubs, the sporting clubs, and the RSL clubs for returned servicemen. So yeah, in a city of 150,000 odd people at the time, there were all these clubs, and the thing about these clubs with respect to the ones founded on the basis of nationality and belonging to a certain cultural group, it felt like they were encouraged to maintain their culture. Most of these clubs had dancing groups that focused on their traditional dance, and these groups would be invited to different community events at different times, different festivals at different times of the year, including times like Australia Day, sometimes at schools. And yeah, I think it was great. I think it was a good way for the community to stay together and to create those bonds and maintain those traditions. And those traditions, those things like the food and the dancing, and well, mainly the food, but they've pretty much become part of what all Australians eat today. Especially around times like Australia Day. These groups are invited to dance and interact, and yeah. So for me, it felt like, over a period of time, my culture, as well as the cultural background of people I grew up around, was accepted into wider Australia. But, one thing that I find myself thinking about more and more, particularly as I get older, and that is that, I didn't really learn about the Indigenous culture, the Aboriginal culture that was pretty much on my doorstep. And it's because their culture was taken away from them in a sense, whereas ours wasn't. And things are changing, but it's only been Well, it's been more so in recent years. And I think, it just highlights how far we have to go. I grew up in an area where the government built houses for the Aboriginal community and then mined the sand behind their homes and filled it with industrial fill, and for years was even a dump. My dad would literally take me to dump rubbish behind my neighbours' homes. And there, playing in the garbage, were the children of those neighbours, Aboriginal children. And believe it or not, I was jealous. I was actually jealous because I wanted to be playing around and looking for, looking for treasure and stuff as well. Not realizing, not understanding the symbolism of it until later in life. And, I used to catch the bus across the road from the entrance to the dump. And quite often there'd be a young boy and he'd be riding his bike in circles around the front gates of the dump. And I would think, oh, he's waiting for the gates to open. But then it's like, no, if he really wanted to go to the dump, he would just walk out his backyard, and I used to envy the kid. I used to wish that I was him, that I could be there waiting for the dump gates to open so that I could go in there. Like, it's just wild, just wild. And the smell, we'd be waiting for the bus and we'd cover our faces at different times because the stench. And these people live there. And I lived a couple 100 meters down the road, but for some reason the prevailing winds helped us in that respect, so we didn't really cop that. But so my upbringing was one where my family were able to maintain their culture, and it slowly merged into these other cultures that I was interacting with as a child and into a young adult, and to who I am today, where I have, friends from a multitude of nationalities, and I guess by culture, obviously I mean the food, as I mentioned earlier, and language as well, mostly swear words. They always seem to be the first words that you learn from another language. But again, the one thing that I feel is missing from my Australian lived experience is the experience of the Indigenous culture, of the Aboriginal culture. I don't have that flavour added to my experience. And as I mentioned before, it is changing. It is happening more and more, but it just needs to be even more. And it's days like Australia Day that highlight this. When you see the mix of cultures celebrating Australia Day and another group protesting it, something isn't right. And I think that as a nation, a very young country, where we're missing out on an opportunity where we could make amends for the things that we've gotten wrong, at different times, and it's not like we haven't gone there before. There's been the Sorry Day and the Bridge Walk and Native Title Acts and along with a lot of other, there've been tons of symbolic gestures and things are changing. I definitely accept that, but I can't help but feel that there's still a hell of a long way to go. Something has to be lasting. There has to be like a discussion or something on this subject about the date, because the way it's going, it just doesn't feel right. And I think sometimes it feels like there are those in the community, particularly those in political circles, that are trying to use this whole topic as leverage. And some of you might be thinking why I'm so passionate about this. And it's pretty simple, really. I never really felt Australian until I left for overseas when I was 28. Like I was caught in this limbo of being a European Australian for most of my life. At school, I was a wog, that derogatory term that was used to categorize anyone from Southern Europe for many, many years. Doesn't get used as much these days. I had Anglo-Australian friends at various times here and there during work life and, at various stages. But it wasn't until I went overseas that I really felt Australian. It was almost as if I was more Australian when I was overseas than here in Australia. Like I wasn't Spanish anymore, even though I was closer to Spain. I was Australian. And over time, it was like the Southern Europeans have become more Australian, while the newer migrant arrivals, for me growing up, it was the Vietnamese and the Lebanese and other Arab nationalities or non-Arab nationalities, but people from the Middle East and different waves of Asian migration of various nationalities, which have now become, the student waves of migration. They're now the ones who cop the racism, and in many cases, it's from those with a similar upbringing to myself. It's almost like in the space of 2 or 3 generations, or in some cases 1 generation, people all of a sudden develop this righteousness, this kind of privilege or standing. I don't know how to describe it. It's like all of a sudden they are more Australian than others, and it just feels wrong. And I guess another thing that comes up to me when I feel like this is I kind of flash back again to my childhood, and I remember a moment when I was 8 or 9, and up until then it had been okay for me to play on the streets with all the other kids, including the Aboriginal kids. And there came this point when all of a sudden I wasn't allowed to play with them anymore. And I think more of that came from my father. And looking back, I kind of get it. They were worried. A lot of the teenagers were getting into drugs and alcohol. Alcohol and drugs were problems in some households, in the streets that I lived in, including the Aboriginal homes. But having said that, it always felt like my dad resented the Aborigines in our street, calling them bludgers, never really going all out into the racism, but he hated the idea of them getting government payments while he worked his ass off. That was one thing that really upset him. Mum was a bit different. I feel that she experienced the racism a bit more. Obviously, they both did. I kind of feel that even today, women are easier targets quite often. But I also believe that she unconsciously recognised that she was on the receiving end of what the Aboriginals were dealing with. And I can distinctly recall an incident where I said something derogatory about them, the Aboriginal kids in the street, and my mum, she just lost it at me, and she said to me, and this was at a young age, but it still hits home, and I can't recall exactly, but it was words to the effect of, don't ever think that you're better than them, because you're not. And that always stuck with me. She empathized with what they were experiencing. I got it. And years later, long after we'd moved to a neighbouring suburb, I was in my late 20s. I remember Mum and Dad were having an argument about something, and not that they argued openly like that very often, but it was one of those moments that I remember clearly. And there was something about a community meeting that had been planned to discuss some new housing estate, and it was a development for elderly Aboriginals, and Dad was worried about them affecting property values and was just being flat out derogatory. Like, mind you, we'd only moved to the neighbouring suburb, which was literally 5 minutes from where we lived initially in Kemblawarra. We'd moved to the adjacent suburb, and I remember getting really upset about it. And I just said, look, they've never done anything wrong to any of us. And you want to go and oppose them building a few houses on land which is theirs anyway. And And we had this argument, and it got pretty heated. And I also said to him that, the only reason why you were able to build here in the first place years ago was that they were here and the values were low because of it. Now, do you get where I'm going with this? And he didn't go, or at least I don't think he went. The development went ahead. Nothing happened. It's still there. And older people, older members of their community have some decent accommodation to move into when they get to that point of their lives. So yeah, look, if people want to change the date, I understand why. Not just from what I've been told or what I've seen in the media or, but from what I've experienced, what I've seen growing up. This isn't just going on for the sake of it. They're not, people aren't saying, get rid of the date and don't replace it. They want a day that includes all of Australia. And I get that. That's a big part of who we are as a nation. And it kind of feels like I'm in this weird, fortunate position where I have Spanish nationality because of my parents, and I have these privileges as an Australian, and I compare that to those who lived up the road from me at Kumirichi. I'd be pretty pissed off if I were in their shoes, put it that way. The Kumirichi community is still there. I drive past most days, and a lot has changed, thankfully. The old weatherboard houses were replaced with brick houses some years ago. They are playing a more active role. They're doing a lot of artwork, sharing stories, making sure that their culture isn't lost, and really working hard at that to share those important stories with the broader community. And it's just so very important. I believe anyway, and I think it's fantastic. So look, I'll start to finish up, but before I do, I experienced racism, as did my parents. I live in a community where pretty much everyone experienced discrimination. And there's like this tone that gets adopted from time to time. You see it on social media when the Black Lives Movement protests were taking place in the US and here in Australia. And it's like some feel, well, I experienced racism and I got over it, so you should get over it. And I'm talking about people in their middle age, like myself, from various backgrounds, whatever they may be, who have this argument that, well, we experienced racism, we got on with it, and we've made good lives for ourselves, and we've worked hard, and we've made money, and, Aboriginal people didn't or haven't. And it just really gets me. Because I look back and I'm so grateful and fortunate that my parents and extended family and many others chose this country, and that they were able to come here and make a life. But at whose expense? I don't claim for a second understand the depths of anger or frustration and, experienced by the Aboriginal community. I can only relate to what I've experienced in my life and how I believe I would feel if I were in their shoes. It's clear that for far too long, the Aboriginal people of this nation were not encouraged to practice their culture, let alone share it with a broader community. And at the same time, that the exact opposite was the case for those that were encouraged to migrate here. So based on all that, look, I believe Australia Day as it currently sits is a day to reflect, not to celebrate. If you're going to have a National Day of celebration, a party, not only does everyone have to be invited, but everyone has to feel good about being part of the celebration. It just makes sense. If it's a national party, if it's a national celebration, well, it's got to appeal to everybody. Why should I celebrate someone else's misery? It just feels so wrong, and I won't do it. Australia's a young country with the oldest known civilization, with a wealth of knowledge. The rest of the world looks to us for inspiration, and far too often we let them down. But I'm pretty hopeful that that's going to change. So, yeah. Look, I've been so blessed to have been born in this country, blessed to live in a country where I can record my stories and share them with you guys. And I really look forward to catching you all again soon. This episode of One Day I'll Tell the Truth was produced by Tony Berea. Sound design by Robert Ferreira. An edited video version of this podcast will be uploaded to YouTube in the coming days. You can find details of all my podcast episodes, including full transcripts, edited video copies, and more about me at tonyberea.com. Thanks for tuning in.